Hi everybody, this is Brett Lonsdale from Lightning Tools and welcome to another webinar on SharePoint Online Permissions Management. So what we're going to take a look at today is just have a look at some of the typical frustrations that some of our customers face when it comes to SharePoint permissions and also leading into Teams permissions as well for that matter. And we're then going to have a look at how our product DeliverPoint is able to help with some of those frustrations. So how can we make the permissions management a lot more smoother, not just for central IT, but also for end users who may be site owners and also site collection administrators as well. So before we dive in, just a quick introduction to Lightning Tools. So we are a company who provide different tools and web parts for Microsoft SharePoint and also Microsoft Teams. And as you can see on here, we cover many different areas, including content aggregation. We've also got a discussion forum tool, list form editors. We have data integration tools such as the business connectivity services and data visualization, which is our data viewer product, and also chart as well. And of course, last but not least, the permissions management, which we're going to be taking a look at today. So who are you talking to? So I'm Brett Lonsdale, and I founded Lightning Tools back in 2007. Seems like a long time ago now. And also I am quite sort of in the community quite a bit with regards to SharePoint Saturdays. In fact, I've hosted many SharePoint Saturdays here in the UK. Also a host on something called TechSplaining.net. So if you go out to TechSplaining.net, you'll be able to listen to us interview different MVPs and Microsoft members and other community members as well on subjects related to Office 365. And of course, if you're going to an event anytime soon, you may see me as a speaker as well. So let's dive into permissions. And what I wanted to talk about initially is really the sort of site owners and site collection administrators and how they go about managing permissions. Now, this is something that has sort of been a problem since the inception of Microsoft SharePoint, even back in SharePoint 2003 days, when we take a site that is designed to be something that is managed by a business user. And when we say managed, those business users who create those sites can create SharePoint lists, they can create SharePoint libraries, they can create obviously folders and content, they can design the columns and views that go into those lists and libraries, and of course they also get to manage the permissions. But there's a bit of a disconnect in the fact that most of those permissions, especially in SharePoint on-premises, were sort of governed through the use of Active Directory security groups, and that posed one problem for site owners, so that when you went to produce a permissions report inside of a SharePoint team site or also inside a SharePoint list or library for that matter, it was kind of obscure. You couldn't see exactly who the members of those AD groups are. In fact, you can't see the members of those AD groups at all. All you could see was the fact that the AD group was nested inside of a SharePoint group and it got permissions that way, or it was directly assigned permissions. And that becomes a challenge for the business user that is managing that site. They can't truly tell who has access to their site, who has access to their lists, libraries, of course, documents, and everything else as well. And also the other side of it is, how do you centrally manage permissions as well? So we've got this sort of responsibility for a site owner who's looking after the content, and then we've also got the central management as well, where there's just so much content to try and manage across your entire tenant or also your entire farm as well. How do you go about doing that? What you certainly don't have time to do is to let's just take some of the sort of typical scenarios. Let's say somebody is going to leave your organization or change roles inside your organization. How do you possibly, as central IT, go and visit every single site, every single list or library, folder and document, and remove the permissions from that individual or give those permissions to somebody else? It's just going to be way too time consuming. You're never going to have a chance to do it. So here's what typically happens. You disable that account inside of the Active Directory, and that person can no longer authenticate, but they are still listed there as being members of groups, maybe having direct access because a file or a folder was shared with them, and so on. And it just becomes a little bit messy. In fact, it raises a few eyebrows in those meetings when somebody says, hey, how come Fred still has permissions to this site when he left a few years ago. So what we need is a tool, and of course DeliverPoint is one of those tools that can help both the IT and also the site owners or site collection administrators to be able to manage permissions more effectively and truly know who's got permissions to your content. So some of the things we hear from our customers are on this slide here. So we ask them what is it that you're looking for from a permissions tool, and people will say that their permissions are a mess, and when we look at what the underlying reason for that is, it might be that there's permission inheritance broken in lots of different places, and of course with sharing links and things like that inside of SharePoint, that is an issue. It's very difficult to actually keep track of where inside my document libraries have folders and documents been shared with internal people, but also external people as well. How do we manage that? There's also the issue of Office 365 groups being created all over the place. So every time you create a new team in Teams, or every time you create a new SharePoint site or a private channel, you're going to get new Office 365 groups being created. And that's more places where users are now members, and that's more places to clean up permissions should one of these users perhaps change roles or leave the organization. So that one we've mentioned, we've talked about. So when users leave the organization, we don't have time to clean it up. There's also no structure to how permissions are granted sometimes as well. So there's lots of different ways of assigning permissions directly by adding them into a document, or putting them into SharePoint groups, putting them into Office 365 groups, which are nested inside of SharePoint groups, or also Active Directory groups as well. So with DeliverPoint, you can actually see how those permissions have been shared with each individual, as well as seeing every single individual that has permissions. Okay, so let's have a look at how some of this works. So we'll have a look at how we can overcome the issue of users sharing content and not being sure who that content has been shared with. So actually, let's just dive straight into a site now and take a look at that as a problem. So here we are going to bring up a SharePoint site. So it's a nice, new, fresh, modern SharePoint site. And in here, when we take a look at the out-of-the-box tools that we have, if we were to come down here to site permissions, we've got the ability here to see who our site owners are and also our site members. And as you can see, there's only a few entries. We've got 2 entries of site owners, and we've got 5 entries of site members. So it doesn't look complex at all. So let's have a look if we were to jump into the advanced permission settings. And this is the sort of classic looking page that we still have inside modern sites. When we go in here, you can see there's a bit of information. We've got a yellow banner that says that there are limited access users. So limited access users means somebody's been granted permissions to a folder or a document or something else that resides in this site without actually having permissions to the site itself. So therefore, they're given limited access. But it also tells us that there's objects in here as well that have broken permission inheritance, which is good. So we can see that information. We can see which of those objects are by clicking onto the show these items. But if we click onto the show these items, it does give us the items, and then of course we need to go to the manage permissions, and that's just on this document library here. But what if we have folders and documents as well, we have to perhaps do that for every single one, which becomes a challenge. We also have the members group here. So let's just dive into that. So that's the out-of-the-box members group. And you can see inside here, we've got a Office 365 group. And I'm telling you this is an Office 365 group. It's called Permissions Demo Members. But there's no way of telling that that's an Office 365 group when you compare it to either accounts payable and also sales, which are both Active Directory security groups. So it's only because I know, because I know the history of this site, that that is an Office 365 group. And with any of these, we can't actually see who are the members of these groups. We don't know who's in accounts payable. We don't know when we click onto the permission demo members group, who's a member of that, and we don't know who's a member of the sales Active Directory security group either. So here I am managing this site. We could have had salespeople that have moved on to do better things and still have access to this. We've also got people in accounts payable. Now, maybe they can't authenticate because they've left the organization and we've disabled their user account, but maybe they just changed roles and we've not updated the Active Directory security group. We may well have done. We may have an Active Directory administrator who's really on top of things, but we don't know for sure whether that's the case or not. So when we're putting content inside of these sites, we don't really know who can access it. So let's have a look at how DeliverPoint makes that so much better. So in the top right hand corner here, what we can do, and this is only available to people that would ordinarily have full control to the site anyway. So this is for people that can already go into the permissions page and be able to assign permissions and so on. They will see these options. And one of the options is just a single click, and that is the Discover Permissions report. And the Discover Permissions report will show us everyone, and I mean everyone, who has got permissions to this site. And just contrast that for a moment with what we saw a moment ago, where we saw just a handful of entries inside the members group. Here we've actually got quite a few people that have got full control. We've got a few more people that also have edit permissions and some that have direct permissions as well inside this site. So the next question is possibly going to be, well, how did they come about having these permissions? And if we just take a look at, say, demo user 4, I can select demo user 4 here. So as we select demo user 4, let's expand that. And sure enough, we can see that demo user 4 is inside this Active Directory security group called accounts payable, which is in turn nested inside of the SharePoint group. So here we can see exactly who's got permissions and how that came about. Now you can sort and filter this however you like. So if we really wanted to sort of focus in on a permission level, what we could do is filter on that permission level. So if I was interested in people with full control, we can provide that. You may see some duplicate permissions, like Sandy Ucia is in here twice. It looks like it's through the same group, but let's go and expand that. And here you can see that she's a member of the SharePoint group directly, but she's also a member of an Office 365 group with the same name as the SharePoint group, which is nested. And then we've also got demo user 10 as an owner as well. So you can filter on that, and of course tidy that up as well if you want to. We can filter by username. So if we are trying to spot any duplicate permissions, we could do that. So if we pick on Sandy again, let's pull that up so we can see all the permissions that Sandy's got and how she came about having those permissions. We can also see how people are permissioned. So if we clear that filter and filter on a group, let's say, so in here we could see, well, who's actually permissioned via sales. And in here I can see that demo user 5 and demo user 9 are actually permissioned through that Active Directory security group called sales. Okay, so that's a sort of great way of being able to determine who's got permissions to the site. But what about all the objects in the site? Even though that was just a single click down to the Discover permissions, we've also got, of course, when we go into a document library, which I've got two document libraries here. I've got one called private documents and one called documents. In order to be able to tell who's got permissions to the document library, we need to first of all go into the library settings. So that is actually up here now. So we go to the library settings, and then of course we can go to the permissions for this document library, and we can see the same sort of thing in there. We'll be able to see whether this document library inherits from its parent or not. If we were to do that on the private document library and go into the library settings and go to permissions for this document library, this time we see that the document library has unique permissions and so on. But there's no way of telling that without actually having to go through those steps and go into that document library and bring up the library settings. And the same goes for folders and documents and so on as well. So you can imagine how many folders and documents you can have in a production SharePoint tenant. If we were to try and figure out, Microsoft has made it a little bit easier now. We can just go to manage access without having to go to share first. So if we go to manage access, in here we can see who's got access to it, but there's nothing in here to say whether or not this has unique permissions. So we have to do another click to get to that advanced page. And once we're in that advanced page, we know that it actually inherits from its parent. Now, we're not going to have time to do that on every single folder or document inside a production tenant. So let's have a look at what we can do. So in the top right-hand corner again, same place, we can actually perform an advanced permissions report. So again, not too many clicks. You can just come down to the Discover Permissions Advanced. And in here, we've got a few options hidden away under settings. So I can include any lists, I can include any items that have unique permissions. I can even dive down into subsites if I want to. So notice I've got subsite 1 and subsite 2 in here as well. So let's do that. Let's hit generate. And what we can see is all the site permissions to this site. And as we scroll down, we actually can see how that runs into subsite 1, and then there's no mention of subsite 2 because subsite 2 happens to be inheriting permissions, whereas subsite 1 has unique permissions. Remember, this is just showing those sites that have unique permissions. So they're the site permissions, and when we filter, it will filter across both. We can collapse that and see the list permissions. So again, no mention of the document library called documents because it inherits, whereas the private document library has unique permissions, and here I am seeing exactly who's got access to private documents. And further down, we've got some folders and so on. So in here, we've got the private folder, more private subfolder, and so on. And we can keep clicking through that to see all of the different items that have unique permissions within inside this site. So if we had somebody leaving, we can filter on their account and see all of the different unique objects that they have permissions to, all from within inside this report. You can make it full screen and so on if you want to. Sorry, I misclicked there. If we want to make that report full screen, we can. And you can also change your scope as well. So here it's showing what the scope is, but we can slide out this panel here and actually go through and have a look at other scopes as well. So it might be other sites that we also want to take a look at within here as well. In fact, not just other sites, but also other Office 365 groups and teams and so on also. So underneath this site, we've got subsite 1 and subsite 2, we've got all the lists and libraries and what have you. And this is another way actually of seeing what has unique permissions and what is inheriting. Notice subsite 2 has this dimmed icon rather than the full color icon of subsite 1. That alone tells me that subsite 2 has inherited permissions, whereas subsite 1 is unique. And likewise with the document library. So the private documents has a full color icon, whereas documents is dimmed because it's inheriting. So there's lots of other useful things that we can do from this view. We can do things like select these two sites, so the top level site and the subsite, even using the Discover Permissions report in DeliverPoint, which can be quite lengthy depending on the number of users that you have. You can't always spot the differences straight away. So by selecting these two sites that both have unique permissions, when we go to reports here, we can compare the permissions. And that will tell us what the differences are between those two sites. And if we want to add more sites, we can do that as well. It's just a simple case of going through and selecting them. Okay, so that's a kind of report that we've got there. Contextually, we can do the same sort of thing within a list or a library. So if we were focusing in on some different objects, let's say you can easily pull up the Discover Permissions reports for those. So notice here we've got the Discover Permissions that we can execute with inside a site. And again, know exactly who's got permissions to that content, or we can do the same sort of thing on the lists and libraries at the top here too. Okay, so the next thing I want to show you is how we can maybe centrally manage those permissions too. And what we'll do for that, we could just pull up the DeliverPoint page again here, where we can go through and select the different scopes and what have you. Or you can actually add this as a web part onto a page. So you could have your own page that is where you want it. It could be just a single page that you want to access through SharePoint, or you could put it on a page and then display that page with inside Teams as well if you wanted to. So you've got your place that you go to as IT to manage permissions across your tenant. So we'll just give this a name of DeliverPoint, and in here we'll add a web part. So we'll add the DeliverPoint web part, drop that into this page here, and we can position it how we want it. Again, you can still make it full screen and so on if you want to, and I'll publish that page. There we go. So now we've got this web part that we can go to, and we can see all the classic site collections, all of the Office 365 groups, and also Teams and private team channels and so on as well, all in the same place. So as we expand this, again, we've got that same sort of view. We can select a site, we can discover the permissions from this report. We can also see the unique objects. So perhaps if we were to choose this as a site collection by clicking onto unique objects, we can execute that from there, and it will show me all of the objects. So I can see that subsite 1 has unique permissions, private documents has unique permissions, and there's also these documents and so on that have permissions as well. And the great thing about this is we give you the ability to go through and manage it too. So if we take this private folder as an example, I can select that, and we can still go through and discover the permissions on that folder and manage the permissions from there too. So I could also go through and remove using the actions. We could do things like delete permissions or grant permissions from here, or even revoke them. So that's the sort of thing you can either maybe do at folder level or multiple folders. If you wanted to, we can do the same thing on multiple sites and or entire site collections. So if again we had somebody that was maybe joining the company, we could copy permissions from an existing user to the person that's starting, or if we had somebody leaving the organization, we could transfer permissions away from user A to user B. We can delete the permissions, which is delete all the permissions. We can grant them. We can also revoke an individual permission level from a user too. So an example of transferring permissions, if we were to hit transfer permissions here, we could take, for example, Sandy and transfer those permissions to another user. So in here we could maybe say demo user 9, and I can choose whether I want to process any subsites, any lists, items, etc. And I've also got the ability to support the rollback of this operation. So as I choose execute, it goes through and transfer those permissions from Sandy to the demo user. But if I ever wanted to roll that back, I could do so. If I actually go into the jobs, I can see that these transfer permissions took place. We can modify any properties in here as well. If we want to, we can change the report date, and we can also roll back those operations too. So we can select those and click onto rollback, which will put it back exactly how it was before we started, which you can see that's going through and now adding Sandy and removing demo user 9. Okay, so great permissions management capabilities centrally or from within inside the site. And like I said, we've also got things like revoke permissions as well. Another view which is really useful if you are going to be performing any of these jobs is to actually be able to search on an individual user. So we could do a search on, say, demo user 9 in here and see what permissions, if we do the unique permissions, we can see what permissions this user has been granted. So actually that's showing up as no actual permissions per se. If we were to put in Sandy as an example, here we get a bit more. So I can see what site permissions she has, what list permissions she has, what item permissions she has, and so on. And also whether she's a site collection admin, what account members she's in, so what groups is she in other words, is all shown through there. And all of these reports are all exportable to Excel if you need to export them. All right, so that's kind of a quick tour of DeliverPoint. And if we just jump back into the slide deck, you can see here that we've got these simple, accurate permission reports that give you complete clarity on who's got permissions. We can perform that across large scopes. So site collections, you don't have to do it object by object like you do with SharePoint. And we can see clearly whether these permissions are granted through security groups with their guest users as well. Would be able to see the difference in that, and also any Office 365 groups. We sort of tackle these broken permissions everywhere by when we execute the report, we can see where the permission inheritance has been broken, and we've got the ability to also reset that permission inheritance as well as another one of the operations. And also we've got the ability to clean up some of the permissions as well should somebody leave the organization or transfer to a different department. The other thing is we also have a dead account removal report. So that one I didn't show you yet, so let's just jump back into the farm-centric view. And if I was to select a single site collection here, what we can do under reports is execute what's known as a dead account report. And this will highlight anybody that happens to be assigned permissions somewhere within inside the site collection, but they cannot be found inside the Active Directory, or they are disabled inside the Active Directory. That determines them as a dead account and allows us to then go through and remove that dead account as well as a cleanup. So in your organization, should somebody leave, you simply go through and delete them, then you can clean up those permissions afterwards. All right, so we've kind of already done the demo. Hopefully you found that useful. And just to point out that DeliverPoint is actually free for 30 days, so you can go ahead and download it. There is a URL here where you can download it from. So if you just go to that tinyurl.com. Obviously, this is going to be shared after this webinar, so you'll be able to find the webinar recording on lightningtools.com, and at the top, just click onto webinars. You'll be able to find it there, and of course, get that URL, or just straight navigate to the page where you can download it. And we do have an offer on at the moment where we're offering a 15-month subscription for the price of 12. So if you are interested in this, it starts from as little as $1,000 for 1,000 users and goes up from there. So if you are interested in this product for your organization, by all means give it a go and download it, install it inside your tenant, or you can also request a private demonstration as well if you want to sort of ask more detailed questions. But for that matter, what I will do is just open up for any questions. So if you do have a question, you can use the chat window, just post your question in there, and I'll be happy to answer it. All right, doesn't seem like there's any questions. So thank you everybody for attending. I hope you found this very useful, and yeah, look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thank you.